Welcome back to the Paradigm Shift. My name is Wrath, and I'm here with Jewel.
Hey,
Last week, we finished our discussion on the Dark Triad, how the psychopaths took control. This week, we're going to begin our discussion on Steve Madison's Soul Science, Know Your Soul. For this discussion, I'm going to be reading some pre-prepared notes of mine that I wrote in response to these quotes, just because this is a very serious and important topic, and I want to make sure I get it as right as I possibly can. So if you see me looking over and reading, that's what I'm doing. So let's go ahead and begin with this first chapter. It's called The New Mystery, and it's basically about science's inability to answer the question of the soul and why that is. Madison says, "You would imagine that the reason the new paradigm was accepted was that it solved the mysteries of the old paradigm. Unfortunately, this isn't how either philosophy or science works. The new paradigm is accepted for ideological reasons, or in fact, just for reasons of personality type and subjective taste and inclination." I want to go ahead and point out what they mean by personality type. Just to clarify, is the MBTI, which stands for Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. Personality types, for an example, an extroverted sensing type is going to have an extremely hard time grasping that the physical world is not all that there is. But an introverted intuitive type would not have that problem. So when people accept or reject paradigms, they are most likely doing so on the basis of their preconceptions of the world. A thinking or judging type would likely be more open to accepting a paradigm that seems true, regardless of how that makes them feel. Whereas a feeling type would have a problem accepting something that makes them feel uncomfortable, or they would prefer an answer that makes them feel good.
yeah, if you're more of a feeler as a type of person, feelings are what matters most to you. You essentially chase good feelings,
Yes.
and that can be, I don't want to overgeneralize, but for a lot of people, if you're a feeling type, that can be your a barometer or like a metric for truth, how it makes you feel. And of course, that is not an indicator of truth at all. Like
Correct.
emotion is fleeting, is transient. It's not concerned with truth.
No. Yeah, that's not to say an ESFP, for example, an extroverted sensing, feeling, perceiving type, is incapable of grasping mathematical idealism. It's just unlikely.
Yeah.
It's just, that is what it is. It's unlikely to happen.
When you quoted Madison, and he says, you would imagine that the reason the new paradigm was accepted was that it solved the mysteries of the old paradigm. Unfortunately, this isn't how either philosophy or science works. The new paradigm is accepted for ideological reasons or personality type, etc. So I just want to point out as well that that very fact about modern science and modern philosophy, even academia in general, makes it inauthentic and lacking integrity because it's not about the pursuit of truth, wherever that leads us, It's about the pursuit of people's special interests or what people are comfortable with, or like we are just saying, the pursuit of feelings, which is like really kind of a sad state. It's not great.
Yeah, as all the authors say, a lot of careers ride on scientific materialism. And so if they were to even engage with a different paradigm, a lot of people would be out of jobs. So
Yeah,
that's in play too. Yeah.
that's so sad that, we're dealing with matters of truth, of reality, and it's like people's careers are more important.
Right out the gate, Madison is saying, look, Mike Hockney has the answers to the big question, but how many people are going to understand that, let alone accept it? That is not how it works because people choose paradigms that agree with their own. For example, if it's not strings, it must be membranes that comprise strings. And I'm talking here about M theory and what comprises membranes. That's the same mystery in a different package. Ontological mathematics actually solves the old mystery and presents new ones. For example, if Aunt Math is true and there is a God equation, what is the reincarnation equation? New mysteries that are actually progressive.
Mhm.
So, surely that must exist or in some form. But instead, science repackages the same question of what is base reality. If it's not this subatomic particle, it's these things that make up subatomic particles.
Mhm.
It's never really an answer.
The question can never be avoided. Like you're saying, it's just repackaged.
Yes.
I find that funny. Like it's like meet the new mystery, same as the old mystery,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
slightly different, you know? It's
Yeah.
it's it's pretty wild.
Yes. Madison says, science has never refuted the existence of the immaterial soul. All it has done is create a paradigm where the immaterial entities cannot be referenced. In the materialist paradigm, only matter is used to explain anything, so the soul or mind has to be explained in material terms. But science has never begun to explain the soul slash mind in material terms. It is a category error to even make the attempt or believe that the attempt is possible. This can be explained by science's conflation of the brain with the mind. They think that because the brain is the control center of the body, where thinking activity can be measured by machines, that the brain is the mind, which is simply not true. Funnily enough, when they take these measurements of mental activity expressed through the brain, they are left with readings of frequency information. It's like right in front of them.
Mhm.
It's just funny.
Yeah, but it's denied only because it doesn't fit in to their paradigm. There
Yeah,
is no other reason to deny it.
yeah,
Paradigm, and of course, careers, which is an extension of the current paradigm we're in. Once again, we're avoiding or denying the truth, simply not for any authentic reason, not for any intellectual reason, but for reasons that really don't matter at all, that are like, oh, comfortable, like what we have, the paradigm we have is comfortable right now. It's familiar. Scientific materialism answers all our questions that we could ever have. Um, Instead of like really trying to look closer, look deeper into what reality is. What is base reality? Why does the presence of mathematics give science so much credibility? Why aren't we asking those questions?
yeah. I wonder if people like celebrity scientists like Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson,
Um,
if they've ever been presented with these questions, because like for example, Neil deGrasse Tyson speaking about time, if you ask him what time is, he will say, I've seen this in interviews, he will say, well, time is a mysterious problem for science. Like there's, and like I think he's comfortable with that.
You define it so that motion is something we can describe easily with equations and things. So that's kind of a cop-out answer, but it's a very functional answer for the physicist. I also think of time as this prison. Time makes us all a prisoner of the present, and that's particularly disturbing. We would learn that we rotate and we revolve around the sun. So that took really long to figure out, disturbingly long. I mean, only like 400 years ago. So what it tells you is that you can keep track of time even though you have no freaking idea what's going on.
Yeah, now he's still an expert and he can kind of dance around the question without answering it. And everyone goes, whoa, this guy, he knows his stuff. But he doesn't ever answer any of the questions that pertain to that.
Yeah, and that goes, I think, to illustrate many people, civilians, whatever it is, their preoccupation with a certain idea just being accepted as true. And like, if there are unknown elements, if there are things they don't know about it, if there are mysteries, that is like totally fine with many people because ultimately they don't want to know. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
Kind of like we've said in the past in previous videos, a lot of people, they're just content with taking things on faith or like believing what their parents taught them or what has been handed down. They don't ask these deeper questions because I think for many people, it's because of fear. They don't know what they'll find if they try and like search for answers to these unknown questions. So they're just content, which is like, oh, it's fine. We pretty much know, right? I mean, I don't need to dig deeper for final answers.
yeah.
We don't want those because we're afraid it's the unknown. This is not familiar to us. This has not been taught to us. We're not comfortable with unsolved problems, so we're just going to pretend like they all have been solved.
Yeah, the answer that something is a mystery is the answer for them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's good enough for a lot of people.
Yes. For non-materialists, matter cannot produce mind under any circumstances. It's a logical impossibility. It's on par with claiming that dreams can create dreamers. It has fundamentally inverted the way reality operates. So my grandfather is an engineer, and I showed him this material, and he made the brain-mind conflation. And I said, I showed him the error there and separated the two. And he said, well, I don't think we'll ever understand the mind. And is effectively ending the like saying, well, that's enough from you,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
that is just it right there. That's an example of what we were just talking about, where it's like
yeah,
the being contented with a non-answer, and that is like just fine for some people.
I think this ties back to the personality types. Someone that's worked on airplanes for 50 years is not going to come close to grasping what could be outside space-time. They're stuck in physics, how to make a plane fly. So that's just his personality type.
And I think sometimes, not always, but sometimes age can factor into it. When you have lived a long and full life, and you've learned certain things, sometimes you tend to become more hardened and set in your ways and dismiss alternative theory or any sort of like question like, don't worry about that, that's stupid. It's really unfortunate, I think, that many people become stuck in their ways.
Yes. Yeah, I don't hold it against him, I'm not taking it personally. But when I meet someone who he'll quote Neil deGrasse Tyson at me, I kind of have to go, oh my God, you should you should read these books. Science doesn't enter into any debate with non-materialists. Its strategy is to disregard any argument advanced by a non-materialist, not to refute any such argument. All arguments that cannot be framed in materialist terms are paradigmatically excluded by materialism. Science does not explain what other systems fail to explain. Science ignores these problems or casts them in new terms, which still have no explanation. The task of ontological mathematics is to refute scientific materialism and to answer everything in terms of sinusoidal monadic minds.
First of all, this idea of science as it currently is doesn't enter into any debate with non-materialists or idealists. Its strategy is to disregard any argument advanced by a non-materialist. Why do you think that is? Like, besides the reasons that we already laid out, like careers, paradigm, things like that. But it seems sometimes, like I've heard Neil deGrasse Tyson talk in the past, and he seemed to have like this very jaded, know-it-all almost attitude sometimes, that any such argument by a non-materialist must be woo-woo, or it must be religious in nature. So it's almost like some scientists think that they're just kind of like cutting through the bullshit by not even addressing the arguments. Like, no, like just
well,
stop, you know.
It's because they don't know. I have two friends that are both career chemists. Met them, 10, I don't know how many years ago, over 10 years ago. And once I found this material, I would have these conversations. I would try to have these conversations with them. And one of them was more open-minded than the other. Person A, that's crazy, whatever, like that's dead. But person B, he would actually entertain these conversations, but he would still hold the stance of rejecting what I'm saying. But he would at least let me say my piece.
Uh-huh.
And at one point I got him to admit, well, that's not what science is about. Science isn't about answering these things. And I'm like, exactly. So that was the only agreement that we came to. Was I think celebrity scientists might do this too, is if you can back them into that corner, they'll say, well, science isn't about why.
Yeah, because I have heard what's his name, Neil deGrasse Tyson before, and others like him, talk about how, like you're saying, the questions why and of like what reality is and things like that are not matters of science. They're matters of philosophy.
Yes.
Also, by the way, philosophy in its modern context, in modern times, the subject of philosophy is kind of like, seems to be kind of like a joke to many people. So it's funny to me how they're saying that, oh, it's not science, it's philosophy, but philosophy is sort of like rejected outright. They're just like, I mean, who has time for that, And we know that philosophy as a discipline is very much not taken seriously in our modern world, because like the possibility of philosophy being a career is long gone. I mean, any sort of importance placed on the questions of philosophy, there is no such importance anymore, which is really sad.
People get distracted because science made cars, for example,
Yeah.
or airplanes, and they say, wow, look at this. This is something that affects me. And
Right.
not knowing certain answers doesn't change people's lives.
True.
That has to be a contributing factor.
The answer to reality, what is reality itself, is perceived to hold no material benefit for
Right.
people.
Right.
Yeah.
People that are overly skeptic say, well, I don't know. Is that the answer? You can't measure it. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, okay, then, if you don't have any discretion, like someone who's so skeptical that they won't even admit that 1 + 1 is 2, because I know people like that. They're like, yeah, they're like, well, but how do we know that? Like, because it's tautological. It
Yeah.
has, yeah, it's like blue is blue. And they're like,
Yeah.
how do we know that? And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, I'm not going to continue. Yeah.
I've met people like that before in my life, where it's like they're normally prone to conspiracy theories or like flat Earth or something. It's like they get off almost on that whole like questioning everything to the point of rejecting logic and rejecting like truth. It's like, yeah, but what if it were not true? I mean, think about that. It's like, oh God.
Yeah. Okay.
One last thing I want to say about the quote you read. When you said the task of on-math is to refute scientific materialism and to answer everything in terms of sinusoidal monadic minds. I just wanted to stress here for anyone hearing that may want to jump to conclusions, thinking that this is like anti-science or something, or like we reject or deny all science and the advancements and improvements science has brought us, the use value that science has. It's not that. It's about converting scientific materialism, which is what we have now, which is like the emphasis of matter is the most important thing, is the source of all things, like purposeless, lifeless atoms, and converting that to scientific idealism, which incorporates mind into it.
Yes.
And gives mind a proper seat at the table with everything else that can incorporate that into the explanation, the grand theory of everything, of all things.
Yes. It's to refute it progressively, as in to say, no. We like science and everything it does, but here's how we go further with science, with philosophy. This will take us to new heights. We're not saying reject all the good things of science. It's to show where science has gone wrong so that everyone can move forward together.
The main thing that is being rejected as well is this attitude, this idea that scientific materialism as it is now can answer everything we need to know about reality, and like that is all we need. We can study matter, but we need to account for matter. Like, what is matter? And we also need to incorporate mind into our science.
On the topic of answering everything in terms of sinusoidal monadic minds, thus refuting materialism, Madison says this turns out to be simple once matter is defined in terms of sinusoidal waves. All arguments concerning matter become arguments about sinusoidal waves, which inherently belong to monadic minds. Because we're very early on in our discussion of soul science, I think now would be a good time to define monadic minds so people know what we're talking about, especially if you're new. If you are, hello, welcome. We need to have a basic understanding of monads and Leibniz's monadology. So I've got this lecture here provided by the teaching company. It's on YouTube. But before we do that, just to give a really good context as to what monads are from Mike Hockney's new book, Ontics, The Revolutionary New Physics, we're going to look at what Mike Hockney has to say first. The universal forms are sinusoidal waves equals basis thoughts. A full set of such basis thoughts equals one mind. One unit of mind, a monad, and one mind is none other than the form of life, as in a Platonic form. In ontological mathematics, the basic substance is the monad, unit. which is a unit of mind, one mind, comprised of a full set of basis sinusoidal waves, which are basis thoughts. So one mind is a complete set of basis thoughts. You can't get a better definition of mind than that. A mind is made of its basis thoughts with which it produces all of its other thoughts simply by combining its basis thoughts. The whole of reality takes place within one point, the singularity. Every monad is itself a singularity within the singularity. So there is no extension at all, except in one very specific mathematical sense. Monads, mental singularities, are made of sinusoids, which are also singularities. These sinusoids are pure frequencies. A pure frequency domain can, via ontological Fourier mathematics, project a space-time domain, and it is that projected domain where extension exists. It's vital to grasp that this projected domain never goes outside the frequency singularity. It is mathematically inside it. It's an internal hologram. So it seems to have extension, but in an absolute sense, it does not, since it is entirely bounded by a singularity, which of course has no extension. This lecture is from Dr. Darren Stauloff. Thank you for your lecture. It's awesome. So this is what a monad is, which is from Leibniz.
He believed that the universe was made up of something called monads. Each monad is a mirror of the entire universe. If one could see into each monad, one could know everything about every other monad, everywhere, all at once, for all time, past, present, future. Nonetheless, each monad is completely autonomous and stands in no relation to any other monad. There are, of course, an innumerable number of monads. Everything in the universe, which is made of monads, works in accordance with a pre-established harmony, and history moves towards a moral kingdom, or a kingdom of God, within the realm of nature.
I just want to point out that the reason the answer of monads is different from scientific materialism's atoms or subatomic particles or strings or membranes is because monads are not a form of matter. They're outside space and time. It's outside of matter. This is a development on Cartesian dualism, extension versus unextension. We're going to continue the lecture, and he's going to talk about Cartesian dualism.
Descartes had established, at least to his own satisfaction, that one can distinguish two fundamental substances in the world. In fact, three, but the two ones I want to deal with first are mind and body. And the difference between them is the fundamental attribute or predicate of the substance of mind is thought, right? The property that minds have is thought. They are, in fact, unextended. One can't think of half a mind or a quarter of a mind. One can't quantify a mind. One can't weigh a mind. One can't spatially locate a mind. It is a non-physical and unextended phenomena. And therefore, there's a strong contrast between that and body or matter, whose essence is extension. By extension, we mean the volume, the ability to take up space, to have position. This also raises questions, again, of necessary versus contingent, because Descartes argued, in fact, one of the ways he established a mind-body distinction, was that the existence of the mind could not be doubted. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Right? You could not doubt the existence of your mind. You could, however, doubt the existence of your body. That's a contingent truth. It is possible, he said, or conceivable at least, that you are in fact unextended and that your experiences of a body could be a dream, or could be something that could be the result of an evil genie. Now, obviously the assumption in believing that there are bodies is that our mind, or the ideas we have in our mind, are reflections of the external world of bodies in the form of the ideas, images, and representations that flash before our mind. I want to next mention the third element of the Cartesian problematic, the epistemology of clear and distinct ideas. This is a rationalist epistemology. Since all we have intimate acquaintance of, in fact, are our ideas, right? The images and representations in our mind. How can we tell which ones are true and which ones are false? And what the Cartesians offered, and Leibniz is one, is basically a sort of psychological doctrine. Those which we perceive with clarity and distinction, and I think the paradigm case of this are mathematical ideas, where we have a very precise, clear definition and sense of exactly what the nature of the idea is, are true. And those which are unclear and indistinct probably are not. This brings us to the problem of interaction. How is it that an extended substance, like my body, can somehow interact with an unextended substance, like my mind? Consider, when physical substances interact, they do so through contiguity, right? They directly impact one another. Billiard balls strike one another and give each other force. How is it that something which only communicates through physical contact can influence something which is not capable of physical contact? What is the mechanism that brings together these two distinct kinds of substances? And of course, the answer is a quandary. There is no clear solution to it. Descartes thought somehow, in some kind of a way, the pituitary gland might be a bizarre medium between the two. That, of course, begged the question, how can a pituitary gland, which is extended, contain a soul which is unextended, since it can have no position? Well, Descartes' followers came up with a logical answer, which is parallelism. They don't, in fact, interact. You may seem to think that you decide to lift your arm and your arm rises, and that there's some causal relation there. But in fact, the rising of your arm simply parallels your decision. They're distinct, their causal order is distinct. It is as if, think of mind and body as two universes, each perfectly tuned clocks. And God the clockmaker tunes them so well that they run in perfect synchronicity. So that just as in your mind you say, I want to lift my arm, so in your body, the clock is run in such a way that your arm lifts. And it would seem as if they're interacting, but in fact, they're just parallel and perfectly tuned.
That'll give you the idea of the problem that Leibniz is answering with monads. We're going to define monads here very quickly.
What Leibniz does is take it a step farther. He says certain features that you thought were bedrock in the world, unlike color and other sensory phenomena, are in fact also illusory in the same way. And specifically, he looks at space, time, and extension. All three give an example of the way he distinguishes between a real metaphysical realm and what Kant would call a phenomenal realm of appearances, the way things look to us. And they look that way because we add elements to them that they don't naturally have. He defines space as something merely relative. I hold it to be an order of coexistences as time is an order of successions. Okay, what does he mean? Again, this is very much like Kant. He argues that space is a three-dimensional mental construction of the arrangement of elements. We see distinct elements, and from each of our points of view, we construct or place those elements in a three-dimensional grid. But the grid is not, in fact, there. It's something we add to organize our experience. What is there are simply the things themselves. In our case, we'll see that they are actually monads. For that reason, he concludes quite rightly that space is relative. There is no absolute position. Positions are all relative to the perception of the viewer. For that reason, in the case of the monadology, we'll see each monad has its own particular point of view or perspective. Space, therefore, is not something objective, but something that our mind contributes to our perception or experience to construct a physical world, which in and of itself is not necessarily physical in the sense in which we think of it. Similarly, time, right? If space is a three-dimensional grid we map on to events that or to phenomena that we see, time is a grid of before and afters that we map on to our perceptions, to our ideas, to our mental states. It makes no sense to speak of a time being out there aside from all of our perceptions. If there were no monads, if nothing existed, there would be no time. So time is something we've added to the universe in the sense of mentally constructed. It's not something that's in the universe in and of itself.
So here I would invite our viewers to check out The Six-Dimensional Universe by Adam Weishaupt, who is another associated author with Steve Madison and Dr. Thomas Stark and Mike Hockney. In this book, Weishaupt explains the relation between space and time. Time is always handled as an ill-defined bodge. It seems to work more by accident than design, but there is no firm theoretical foundation for it. Why does it work at all? Time is regarded as a one-dimensional scalar quantity. It has a magnitude, and in our experience, it only goes one way, forward. But consider distance. A straight line between 2 points is a one-dimensional scalar. But if we have drawn a straight line in a 3D space, then its two ends may have x, y, and z coordinates, such as 3, 4, 7, and 10, 2, 8, i.e. it is now actually a vector, a directional line, in 3D space and not just any old line. But in real life, its magnitude may be all that really matters to us. If we have to walk 10 kilometers over flat land from one place to another, it is the distance traveled that will matter to us. We won't be aware of how the x, y, and z coordinates constantly change as we move. The vector elements are almost irrelevant. Obviously, we need to be walking in the right direction to reach our desired destination. But once that is established, it is the magnitude that preoccupies us. Time is treated as scalar, but is actually a vector exactly like distance. We just don't notice its vector aspects. In 6D, 3 real, 3 imaginary, it is possible to go forwards, backwards, left, right, up, down. Exactly the same is true of imaginary space, hence of time. In 6D, 3 real, 3 imaginary space, positive and negative space, and imaginary and negative imaginary space can all be defined. By the same token, positive and negative time and imaginary and negative imaginary time can all be defined. A proper scientific theory of everything needs to be able to clearly distinguish between all of these different cases. Time needs to be completely re-examined in philosophical, religious, and scientific terms. The 6D, 3 real, 3 imaginary paradigm provides the only mathematically, scientifically, and philosophically coherent framework in which to define and analyze time. It's time for a scientific reevaluation of all values. If you want a full explanation of this, check out The Six-Dimensional Universe by Adam Weishaupt.
He goes, however, one step even further and says the same can be true said of extension. And the significance of this is, remember, extension is the essence of matter. So what he's offering is an extremely strong critique of materialism that is proto-Berkeleyan. He argues that extension is also a relative and reducible notion. Reducible, namely, to the contiguity of various parts at one place and time. What this means, basically, is that our notion of space, if we recur to it, right, a three-dimensional grid we've mapped on to things, to our experience of distinct substances and elements. Our notion, it involves a notion of extension, whereby when we have various things directly contiguous, sort of hanging together, being together, we posit that they take up a certain volume. And that's the way we construct those things. But that volume and that aggregation is something we add in and of itself. It's not extended. Now, this is a very bizarre notion, but monadology bears some surface resemblance to atomism. The analogy could be drawn in this way. We think of a substance like this podium as solid. But according to atomic theory, in fact, most of it is vacuous. When we get down to the atomic level, most of what comprises this podium is, in fact, space between particles. So there is, in fact, no extension here, or very little extension. Most of it is, the extension is a posit to make sense out of the aggregation of atoms within this podium. And the monad serves a very similar function, except that unlike the atom, which is itself extended, the monad is not. That, again, seems a very strange notion, but consider, if we get beyond the atomic theory of atoms and subatomic particles and get to the constituents of what makes up an electron, when we get to the level of energy, that too turns out to really be, in some sense, non-extended. So it's, again, a strange notion, but it's not entirely that far off from what certain physicists believe. In any case, what we see is that extension involves plurality and aggregation. Therefore, because it involves plurality, Leibniz can logically deduce that it can only apply to aggregates, by which he means that it's infinitely and infinitesimally divisible. Therefore, simple substances, which are not aggregates, cannot be extended, since extension only applies to aggregates. That is why he deduces that the monads must be unextended. And in fact, the best way to think of monads is as a sort of metaphysical point.
That's where we have our answer of what monads are, and that base reality is unextended. It's outside space and time.
They are, in fact, simple substances, the most basic elements of which all of the universe is made. And again, the analogy with atomic theory here is good. In fact, it's probably better than atomic theory because we now know atoms are made of smaller parts. So we could think of these monads as sort of an analogy with energy fields or energy points or quarks or whatever, what have you. The analogy begins to break down is when he argues that monads have substantial forms or entelechies. That monads are in fact, or have in fact, souls. First of all, why does he think such a curious doctrine? And then secondly, what can that possibly mean? Well, what he has in mind, the reason he thinks that is, consider, we've eliminated extension. What were the substances we had? We had God, matter, and mind, right? We're leaving God aside for now. We've gotten rid of matter. There's no extension. What's left? Only mind, only soul. So it is a natural and logical inference to draw, therefore, that the monad must simply be, in a sense, a soul. Now, what does that practically mean? Well, it practically means that in some sense, within the monad, it has a guiding principle which determines its development.
Obviously, there's much more to this lecture, and to Leibniz, of course, but this is a good stopping point for this part of our discussion on Steve Madison's soul science. I highly recommend watching this lecture and others on Leibniz and the monadology. The link to this lecture is in the description. So we've identified what is meant in the chapter, The New Mystery, about science always replacing the mystery with the same mystery in different terms. We have identified what a monad is, and in future discussions we will discover what Madison means by, once matter is defined in terms of sinusoidal waves, all arguments concerning matter become arguments about sinusoidal waves, which inherently belongs to monadic minds. We'll see in future discussions that sinusoidal waves is the product of monadic activity. I hope this was a helpful and fun discussion. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. And as always, the links to the book and all the resources we use are in the description. Bye.
See ya.